In the first cold months of 1945, the Third Reich was a collapsing giant. On paper, Germany was still a formidable power, with armies in the field and a government that demanded total obedience from its people. But in reality, the nation was defeated. The war machine that had once stormed across Europe was running out of fuel, out of soldiers, and out of time. The grand promises of a 1,000-year empire had dissolved into the harsh reality of daily bombing raids, dwindling food supplies, and the constant fear of an approaching enemy. The end was near, but it had not yet arrived. Germany existed in a strange and terrible limbo, a state of being conquered but not yet fully occupied. The fighting continued, but it was a fight without hope, a final desperate act of a regime facing its own destruction. For the German people, life had become a struggle for simple survival. In cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, the nights were filled with the sound of air raid sirens, followed by the thunderous roar of Allied bombs. By day, people would emerge from their shelters to find their homes, their streets, and their lives turned into landscapes of rubble and ash. The government, led by Adolf Hitler, still projected an image of unbreakable will. Propaganda posters still called for sacrifice and resistance, promising new wonder weapons that would turn the tide of the war. But few truly believed it anymore. The faces of the people on the streets showed a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a deep, unspoken sense of dread for what the future held. The German army, the Wehrmacht, reflected this national state of decay. Once a proud and seemingly invincible force, it was now a shadow of its former self. On the front lines, units were made up of old men and young boys, many of whom had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch national militia. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often sent into battle with little more than a rifle and a few days' worth of rations. Their commanders were caught between the orders from Hitler to fight to the last man and the military reality that told them resistance was futile. Many soldiers knew the war was lost, but they fought on, driven by a fear of their own leaders as much as by a fear of the enemy. This period, from late 1944 into the spring of 1945, was a time of contradictions. Germany was a nation that had lost the war but refused to stop fighting. It was a country whose cities were being systematically destroyed while its government demanded unwavering loyalty. It was a place where millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in the final violent moments of a conflict that had already been decided. The final surrender was inevitable, but before it could happen, Germany would have to endure the last agonizing months of a war it had started, a war that was now coming home to consume it completely, street by street, and city by city. The final defeat of Germany was being carried out by two massive Allied forces advancing from opposite directions. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was a terrifying and powerful force. Having pushed the German army back across Eastern Europe, the Soviets stood on the banks of the Oder River, just a short distance from Berlin itself. Their advance was swift and brutal, driven by a desire for vengeance after years of devastating war on their own soil. The Red Army moved with incredible speed, its vast numbers of tanks and soldiers overwhelming the depleted German defenses. For the German soldiers and civilians in their path, the approach of the Soviets was a source of profound terror, fueled by stories of the Red Army's ferocity. In the West, the advance of the American, British, and other Allied forces was more measured and methodical. After landing in Normandy in June 1944, they had fought their way across France and Belgium, pushing the German army back to its own borders. Their progress was slower than the Soviets in the East, partly because of logistical challenges, and partly because of determined German resistance at key points. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower favored a broad front strategy, moving his armies forward together to ensure no part of the line was left vulnerable. This steady, relentless pressure was like a slowly closing fist, squeezing the life out of the Third Reich from the west. The difference in speed between the two fronts created a strange dynamic. The rapid Soviet push in the east put immense pressure on the German high command, forcing them to move their best remaining units to try and stop the tide. This in turn weakened their defenses in the west, making it easier for the American and British forces to achieve their objectives. The German leadership was trapped, trying to fight a two-front war with an army that was no longer capable of fighting on one. Every soldier sent to hold back the Soviets was a soldier who could not be used to defend the industrial heartland of the Ruhr from the Western Allies. This strategic situation set the stage for the final battles of the war in Europe. While the world watched and waited for the final assault on Berlin, which everyone knew would be led by the Soviets, critical victories were being won in the West. These victories would not only break the back of the German army, but also shape the political map of post-war Europe. The race was on, not just to defeat Germany, but to determine who would control its territory when the fighting finally stopped. The soldiers on the ground, however, were less concerned with politics. They were focused on the next town, the next river, and the next battle in the long, hard road to victory. For centuries, the city of Cologne had been one of Germany's great cultural and religious centers, dominated by its magnificent cathedral. By March 1945, it was a ghost of its former self. Years of Allied bombing had reduced the once vibrant city to a sprawling field of rubble. Yet, as long as it remained in German hands, it stood as a powerful symbol of defiance. The battle for Cologne was therefore more than just a military objective. It was a fight for a symbol. American forces of the U.S. First Army began their assault on the city in the first days of March, expecting fierce resistance from the dug-in German troops. The fighting was street to street, a slow and dangerous process of clearing out buildings and cellars one by one. The German defenders, a mix of regular army units and Volkssturm militia, fought with a grim determination. They knew they could not hold the city for long, but they were under strict orders to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. In the ruins of what were once homes and shops, they set up machine gun nests and anti-tank positions. The battle for Cologne was fierce, but it was also one-sided. The Americans had overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and air power. German tanks that tried to counterattack were quickly spotted and destroyed. Slowly but surely, the American GIs pushed the defenders back toward the Rhine River, which flowed through the heart of the city. One of the most famous moments of the battle was captured on film, a dramatic duel between an American Pershing tank and a German Panther tank right in the shadow of the Great Cologne Cathedral. The German tank had already destroyed an American Sherman tank and was terrorizing the American soldiers. The Pershing tank was called in, and in a tense standoff that lasted only a few moments, the American crew outmaneuvered and destroyed the Panther. This small victory was symbolic of the larger battle. It showed that even the best remaining German equipment was no match for the power and skill of the advancing Allied forces. By March 7th, the last German defenders had been cleared from the west bank of the Rhine, and the city of Cologne was officially in American hands. The capture of Cologne was a major blow to German morale. It was one of the largest cities in Germany, and its fall was broadcast around the world as a sign that the end was truly near. For the German soldiers who had been forced to retreat across the Rhine, leaving the historic city behind, it was a moment of profound defeat. They had failed to hold a key defensive position and a cherished national landmark. The city itself was a wasteland. When its evacuated citizens began to return, they found a place of utter destruction. The great cathedral stood tall, miraculously spared from complete collapse, but it was surrounded by nothing but ruins, a silent witness to the terrible cost of the war. Just as Cologne was falling, a discovery of immense strategic importance was made a short distance up the Rhine River. On March 7, 1945, advance units of the American 9th Armored Division reached the town of Remagen. To their astonishment, they saw that the Ludendorff Bridge, a large railway bridge spanning the river, was still standing. The Rhine was the last major natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany, and the German High Command had ordered all bridges to be destroyed to stop the Allied advance. The Americans had expected to have to fight their way across the river in a difficult and costly amphibious assault. The sight of an intact bridge was an opportunity that could not be missed. The German soldiers tasked with demolishing the bridge had tried to carry out their orders. They had packed the structure with explosives, but for a number of reasons, faulty wires, low-quality explosives, or the sheer luck of the Americans, the main charges failed to detonate properly. A massive explosion rocked the bridge, but when the smoke cleared, it was damaged, but still usable. A small, brave group of American soldiers, under heavy fire, rushed onto the bridge. They fought their way across, cutting wires and throwing any remaining explosives into the river. Within hours, American infantry were pouring across the Ludendorff Bridge, establishing a secure foothold, or bridgehead, on the eastern side of the Rhine. News of the bridge's capture electrified the Allied command. General Eisenhower famously declared that the bridge was worth its weight in gold. The unexpected breakthrough at Remagen completely disrupted the German defensive plans. Instead of having time to regroup and fortify the east bank of the Rhine, the German army was now faced with a major Allied force already on the other side. Hitler was furious when he learned that the bridge had been captured intact. He ordered immediate and relentless attempts to destroy it. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, sent planes including new jet fighters to bomb the bridge, and they even fired V-2 rockets in a desperate attempt to bring it down. For 10 days, the bridge at Remagen became the focus of the war in the West. While German forces tried desperately to destroy it from the air, American engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce it from below. At the same time, the U.S. Army rushed as many troops and as much equipment as they could across the river. They also began building pontoon bridges nearby to support the growing bridgehead. Although the Ludendorff Bridge eventually collapsed on March 17 from the accumulated damage, it had already served its purpose. By then, thousands of Allied soldiers were firmly established on the eastern side of the Rhine, ready to begin the final drive into the German heartland. The miracle at Remagen had shortened the war and saved countless lives. As American soldiers pushed deeper into Germany, they were accompanied by a special group of men who fought not with rifles but with cameras. Among them was one of Hollywood's most famous directors, George Stevens. He was the head of a unit called the Special Film Project, a hand-picked team of cameramen and photographers from the United States Army Signal Corps. Their mission was unique: to create a high-quality film record of the war in Europe for the archives. They were not just newsreel cameramen capturing quick clips for the cinemas back home. They were tasked with documenting the war in a way that would preserve its reality for future generations, a historical document of the victory over Nazism. George Stevens and his team were given access to the front lines, and they carried with them the best equipment available. In addition to the standard black and white film used by most war correspondents, they had something very rare and special: 16mm color film. At a time when the world saw the war almost exclusively in shades of gray, Stevens was capturing the conflict in vivid color. He believed that color film would provide a more truthful and impactful record of events. His footage would show the true color of the flames consuming a German town, the green of the American Army uniforms, and the pale, frightened faces of German civilians and captured soldiers. These filmmakers were soldiers themselves, and their work was dangerous. They moved with the advancing infantry, sharing the same risks and witnessing the same horrors. They filmed the immediate aftermath of battles, the long columns of German prisoners, and the interactions between American GIs and the local population. Their cameras rolled as troops advanced through shattered cities like Aachen and Cologne, providing a moving, ground-level view of the war's final chapter. The United States Air Force also had its own camera teams, who mounted cameras in their planes to document the success of their bombing missions and the dramatic air battles fought to defend key locations like the bridge at Remagen. Much of the color footage shot by George Stevens' unit was not seen by the public for decades. It was considered too raw, too real, and often lacked the fast-paced combat scenes that newsreels demanded. The footage was carefully stored away in military archives and was only rediscovered years later in Stevens' personal collection. When it finally emerged, it provided a stunning and deeply human look at the end of the war. It transformed the black and white images of history into something immediate and relatable, allowing future generations to see the final days of the Third Reich exactly as the soldiers and filmmakers saw them. The cameras of George Stevens and his team did not shy away from the brutal reality of the war's final months. Their lenses captured a landscape of almost unimaginable destruction. One of the most shocking sights was the town of Düren, located west of Cologne. Before the war, it was a pleasant, ordinary German town. After a massive Allied bombing raid in late 1944, it was, as one American military journalist wrote, nothing but a pile of rubble. Stevens' color footage of Düren is haunting. It shows a silent, empty world of skeletal buildings and streets choked with debris. The film captures the totality of the destruction, turning an entire town into a monument to the devastating power of modern warfare. After a city like Cologne was captured, the filmmakers documented a slow, sad procession. They filmed the original inhabitants of the city, who had been evacuated during the fighting, as they returned to what was left of their homes. The footage shows men, women, and children picking their way through the ruins, their faces a mixture of shock and grief. They carried what few possessions they could salvage in carts, suitcases, or on their backs. These images captured a profound human tragedy. These were the people who had, either through support or silence, allowed the Nazi regime to flourish. Now, they were facing the direct consequences as they tried to rebuild their lives from the absolute wreckage of their world. The cameras also turned to the defeated German soldiers. The filmmakers recorded the moments of surrender, capturing the faces of young boys and old men who were now prisoners of war. Their expressions told a story of exhaustion, relief, and uncertainty. After years of fighting for a cause they were told was glorious, they were now disarmed and defeated, facing an unknown future at the hands of their enemies. The footage shows them being searched by American soldiers and marched away in long gray columns. These scenes were powerful evidence of the collapse of the German military machine. The once proud Wehrmacht was broken, its soldiers now just weary men glad that, for them, the fighting was finally over. Through their work, these American filmmakers provided a vital historical record. They showed not only the military victory, but also the human cost of that victory. Their films documented the physical destruction of Germany's cities, but they also captured something less tangible, the psychological destruction of a people. The images of returning civilians and surrendering soldiers were a testament to the complete and total nature of Germany's defeat. They were not just images of a military loss, they were images of a society that had collapsed, a nation that had lost its way and was now forced to confront the terrible emptiness left behind by war. In the final months of the war, the attitude of the German people was a complex mixture of fear, defiance, and a growing sense of denial. On one hand, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi leadership demanded that the fight continue to the very end. Hitler issued a stark directive from his bunker in Berlin, making it clear that surrender was not an option. Any commander who gave up without a fight, or any soldier who surrendered without being wounded, would be considered a traitor. His family would be shamed publicly, and all financial support from the state would be cut off. This threat held families responsible for the actions of their soldiers, a cruel tactic designed to force men to fight on, even in the most hopeless situations. This official policy of no surrender stood in stark contrast to the reality on the ground. In cities like Aachen, the first major German city to be captured by the Allies in October 1944, the local commander eventually surrendered to save his remaining troops. He believed that further resistance was pointless, and that his soldiers would be of no use to Germany dead. Many German soldiers shared this view. They were tired of the war, knew it was lost, and saw no reason to die for a cause that had already failed. They were caught between their own desire to live and the harsh orders from a leadership that was completely disconnected from their reality. As American forces liberated German towns, United States intelligence officers began to observe the attitude of the civilians. They noted a consistent and troubling pattern. The vast majority of Germans they spoke to claimed they had never supported the Nazis. They universally denied any personal responsibility for the regime's crimes or the war itself. Instead, they focused on their own suffering, the bombing, the lack of food, the loss of their homes. There was very little reflection on why this had happened or what role they might have played. This widespread denial was a psychological defense mechanism, a way for people to cope with the overwhelming shame and reality of their nation's defeat and its terrible actions. This sense of denial was captured perfectly by a woman from Aachen named Claret Trafford. In her diary, written shortly after her city fell, she expressed a deep fear for the future. She worried that the German people were not learning the lesson of their own history. In 20 years' time, she wrote with chilling accuracy, "There will again be enough idiots around who will ignore what has happened and be willing to start the same misery all over again." Her words revealed a troubling truth. Even as the Third Reich was collapsing, many of its people were already beginning to rewrite their own history, distancing themselves from the past in a way that would complicate Germany's path forward for decades to come. The capture of the bridge at Remagen had punched a hole in Germany's last line of defense, but the final massive assault across the Rhine was still to come. On March 23, 1945, the Western Allies launched Operation Plunder, a huge and carefully planned operation to cross the river on a broad front. Over 1.5 million soldiers were involved, making it one of the largest river crossings in military history. Under the cover of a massive artillery barrage and smokescreens, thousands of boats began to ferry troops to the eastern bank. At the same time, engineers worked at incredible speed to construct pontoon bridges capable of carrying tanks, trucks, and other heavy equipment. The German resistance, which the Allies had expected to be fierce, was surprisingly weak. The German army was exhausted, demoralized and stretched thin. The best units had been bled dry on other fronts, and the soldiers who remained were often poorly supplied and lacked the will to fight a battle they knew they could not win. The once mighty Wehrmacht, which had stood as a seemingly unbreakable wall along the Rhine, now crumbled in the face of the Allied onslaught. The crossing was a stunning success, achieved with far fewer casualties than military planners had feared. The path into the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, was now wide open. With Allied armies now deep inside Germany from both the east and the west, the final collapse of the Third Reich happened quickly. American and British forces fanned out, encircling and capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in the Ruhr pocket. Other units raced eastward, linking up with the advancing Soviet Red Army at the Elbe River in late April. The two great Allied forces that had been fighting their way toward each other for years finally met, cutting Germany in two. This historic link-up was a clear and undeniable signal that the war in Europe was over. All that remained was the final surrender. The events of March 1945, the fall of Cologne, the capture of the Remagen Bridge, and the successful crossing of the Rhine, were the final nails in the coffin of Nazi Germany. They broke the German army's ability to offer any meaningful resistance, and shattered any remaining hope of a miraculous turnaround. In the weeks that followed, Adolf Hitler would take his own life in his Berlin bunker, as Soviet soldiers closed in. On May 7, 1945, what was left of the German High Command signed the document of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was officially over, and the long, difficult process of occupying and rebuilding a shattered and defeated nation could finally begin.